The coat still smelled like her, even after 2 years of hard wind and harder riding, and that was the singular fact that Joel Underwood could not escape no matter how far he pushed his horse or how deep he buried himself in the business of cattle and open range. It had been the autumn of 1881, late October, when the storm came down from the north like something biblical. Joel had been riding the long trail back from Abilene, tired to his bones after 6 weeks pushing longhorns through dust and heat that could bake a man's reason right out of him. He had stopped at the small settlement of Caldera Creek, just a handful of buildings huddled together against the Kansas flatlands as though they were afraid the sky might swallow them whole. He had tied his horse at the post outside the general store and gone inside for a tin of coffee and whatever news the storekeeper felt like giving for free. That was when he first saw Louisa Sawyer. She was standing at the counter with a list written in careful handwriting, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet that had seen better years but was kept with obvious pride, the ribbon tied just so. She was dressed plainly, a woman of modest means clearly, but there was nothing plain about the way she held herself. Her back was straight, her chin was level, and when she spoke to old Harlan Prout behind the counter, her voice carried the kind of quiet certainty that made a man pay attention without knowing exactly why. Joel had taken his hat off the moment he stepped inside, which was just good manners, and he had moved to the side of the store to examine a row of saddle oil tins while he waited for her to finish. He was not a man who eavesdropped on purpose, but the store was small and she was not whispering. "I need the flour and the salt, Harlan, and if you can manage it, a small tin of molasses. My grandmother is particular about her biscuits and I will not disappoint her." Harlan Prout had laughed the way only old men with nothing pressing do. "Miss Sawyer, your grandmother has been particular about her biscuits since before your daddy was born. I imagine she will survive." Louisa had smiled at that, and Joel had caught the edge of it from across the store, the way her whole face shifted with genuine warmth, and something inside him had gone very quiet, the way the air goes quiet just before a storm. And then the storm had come, quite literally. The first crack of thunder had rattled the store windows so hard that Louisa had startled. Her hand pressed briefly to her chest, and within 60 seconds the sky had opened up with the kind of October fury that Kansas reserved for people who had grown too comfortable. Rain hit the windows sideways. The temperature dropped fast enough that Joel could feel it changing the air inside the store, and when Harlan Prout looked out through his fogged glass and said, "That is a blue norther, sure enough, and she came faster than I have ever seen one come," everyone in the store understood that nobody was going anywhere for a good while. There had been 4 other people sheltering in the store within 10 minutes, including 2 trail hands Joel vaguely recognized, and a local farming family. The husband and wife and their young son huddled near the wood stove that Harlan had gotten going with practiced speed. Louisa Sawyer had stood near the window with her wrapped parcels held in front of her, watching the rain sheet down the glass with an expression that mixed concern with something that looked a lot like calculation. Joel had stepped up beside her, not close enough to be improper, just near enough to look out the same window. "You have far to go?" he had asked. She had glanced at him sideways, a measuring look, the kind a woman learns to give men she does not know when she is alone, and there is no one to stand between her and whatever trouble might present itself. Joel had understood that look. He had sisters. "A mile and a half," she had said. "My grandmother will be worried. A mile and a half in this will soak you to the skin before you are 20 steps out the door," he had said, and he had not meant it as anything except practical information. "You are better off waiting it out. My grandmother is 73 years old and she will be alone in that house." There was a finality in the way she said it that Joel recognized as not a complaint but simply a statement of what would happen next, the way cattlemen spoke about a hard thing that needed doing regardless of conditions. He had reached for his coat before he was entirely aware he had made the decision. It was a heavy oilskin riding coat, long enough to reach a man's boot tops, and it had kept out worse rain than this over the years. He had held it out to her. "It is not elegant," he had said, "but it will keep you dry." She had looked at the coat, and then she had looked at him, and there had been something in that moment that he could not quite name, a kind of recognition between two people who have never met but somehow understand something essential about each other. "I cannot take your coat," she had said. "You can give it back whenever it is convenient. I am planning to overnight in Caldera Creek. I will collect it tomorrow from wherever you care to leave it." She had searched his face for a long moment, and whatever she was looking for, she had apparently found enough of it to satisfy her, because she had reached out and taken the coat from his hands with a quiet "thank you" that he had felt somewhere in the center of his chest. "I am Joel Underwood," he had said. "Louisa Sawyer," she had replied, and she had pulled the coat on over her good dress, and it had swamped her completely, falling nearly to her ankles, and she had done up two of the buttons with businesslike efficiency, and then she had walked straight out into the storm without looking back. He had stood there with the cold air pouring through the briefly opened door and watched her go, her slight figure wrapped in his coat, her head bent against the wind, moving through the rain with that same straight-back determination that had caught his eye at the counter. He had stayed the night in Caldera Creek as promised, taking a room at the boarding house that passed for such in a town that size, and in the morning he had gone to collect his coat. But Harlan Pruitt had told him that Miss Sawyer had left the coat early that morning, with instructions that the cowboy who had lent it should have it with her thanks and her apologies for the inconvenience. She had been and gone before he was even awake. He had put the coat back on and ridden out south, and he had told himself that was the end of it, just a small kindness in a storm, the sort of thing decent people did for each other out here, where decency was something you maintained deliberately against a landscape that did not particularly care whether you lived or died. But he had not stopped thinking about her. Not on the long trail south that autumn, not through the winter he spent at the Callaway Ranch in Texas doing mending work and helping with a horse-breaking contract, not in the spring when the world turned green and the cattle drive started up again, and there was enough work and noise and physical exhaustion to fill every hour of every day. He had thought about Louisa Sawyer in the spaces between things, the way you think about a song you only heard once and cannot quite remember but cannot get rid of either. He thought about the way she had looked at the coat before she took it, and the way she had said thank you, and the way she had walked out into that storm without flinching. He thought about her grandmother and the biscuits and the careful handwriting on the list. He had told himself it was foolish. He had told himself that she was likely married by now, or spoken for, a woman like that did not stay unmarried long in the territories where women were scarce and men were many. He had told himself he did not even know her, that a 5-minute conversation in a general store during a storm did not constitute knowing a person. And then spring of 1883 came, and a cattle drive contract brought him back through Kansas. And when the trail boss said they would be laying over 2 days near Caldera Creek to let the herd rest and water before the push north, Joel Underwood had said nothing at all about having any personal reason to welcome that stop. He had waited until the first afternoon when the cattle were settled, and the other men were resting or playing cards or riding into the nearest town for whiskey, and then he had saddled up a fresh horse and ridden the 15 miles to Caldera Creek, with his heart doing something uncomfortable in his chest that he refused to examine too closely. The town looked the same. These small settlements either died or stayed exactly as they were for decades, and Caldera Creek had apparently chosen the latter. Harlan Pruitt's general store still occupied the same corner, still had the same faded paint on the sign, still had horses tied at the rail outside. Joel tied his own horse and went in. Pruitt was older, or maybe Joel was just more aware of age now, but the old man looked up at him with immediate recognition. "Underwood," Pruitt said. "You came back through." "Trail business," Joel said, which was true enough. "How is the town getting on?" "Same as always," Pruitt said. "Slow and stubborn. You want anything, or are you just here to look at my ceiling?" Joel turned his hat in his hands. He was 31 years old. He had been in more difficult situations than this. He had once talked a nervous rancher out of a fence war with his neighbor that would have gotten people killed, and yet the question he wanted to ask felt harder than any of that. "I am looking for someone," he said. "Louisa Sawyer, 2 years back in this store during the Norther. I lent her my coat." Prout looked at him for a long moment with something knowing in his old eyes. "I remember," he said. "She told me that story more than once as a matter of fact." Something in Joel's chest shifted. "She did." She mentioned it was a considerable act of generosity from a stranger. Prout paused, arranging a row of tobacco tins with deliberate care. "She is still here in Caldera Creek. Her grandmother passed this past January, rest her soul. Louisa is running the laundry now, the one on Birch Street, 2 blocks east." Joel took a breath that was slower than he intended. "She is not married." Prout shook his head. "She had a beau for a spell, fella named Griffith, who came through looking to set up a hardware concern, but that did not amount to anything. She is on her own, working hard as she always has." Joel put his hat back on. "Much obliged." He found Birch Street without difficulty, and the laundry was exactly where Prout had described. A low building with steam wisping from its open door, and a long line of washing strung in the side yard, white sheets moving in the afternoon wind like flags. There was a painted sign above the door that read Sawyer Laundry in neat letters that he recognized, even from 2 years ago, as the same careful hand that had written that shopping list. He stood outside for a moment that was probably longer than dignity required. Then he walked in. The front room of the laundry served as a counter and reception area, and it was empty of customers but not of presence. From the back room came the sounds of work, the heavy slosh of water, the creak of a wringer, and a woman's voice humming something that might have been a hymn or might have been something more cheerful that had been slowed down to a hymn's pace by the rhythm of labor. Joel cleared his throat. The humming stopped. Louisa Sawyer appeared in the doorway between the front and back rooms, drying her hands on a cloth, and she stopped when she saw him the way a person stops when they see something they were not expecting, but which is not entirely a surprise either. She was 25 now, 2 years older than when he had seen her last, and those 2 years had added something to her face, not age exactly, but a kind of settled quality, the look of a person who has made peace with what life has given them and chosen to manage it with grace. She was still slim, still straight-backed, still had her dark hair pinned up, though she wore no bonnet now, just a plain work dress with the sleeves pushed to the elbows and a practical apron over it all. Her hands were reddened from the hot water, and she had a strand of dark hair across her forehead that she had not had time to pin back. She was, Joel thought, more beautiful than he had remembered, and he had remembered her well. "Mr. Underwood," she said. The fact that she remembered his name did something to his breathing. "Miss Sawyer," he said, "I was riding through and I thought I would come by and make sure my coat served you well." A small smile crossed her face, and it reached her eyes, which were a warm shade of brown that he had spent 2 years occasionally trying to remember precisely and had never quite managed. "Your coat served me excellently. I am sorry I was not there to return it in person. I left early because my grandmother needed her breakfast, and I did not want to impose on your morning." "You were not an imposition." "I did not know that," she said simply. "You were a stranger." "I was hoping," Joel said, and then he paused because the next part required a kind of honesty he did not often practice out loud, to become somewhat less of a stranger, if that would not be unwelcome. She looked at him with that same measuring look from 2 years ago in the storm, the one that assessed and weighed and arrived at conclusions with quiet efficiency. Then she looked back at the doorway to the back room, where the sounds of work waited, and then at him again. "I have 3 more hours of work before the day is done," she said. "But if you would care to come back at 6 o'clock, I generally take supper at the boarding house. It is not a formal place, but the food is decent, and the company is whatever you make of it." It was as much of an invitation as it was, which was quite a lot when you understood how these things worked on the frontier, where directness was not rudeness but simply efficiency in a life that had little room for elaborate social performances. "I will be there at 6, Joel said. He turned to go, and then she said, "Mr. Underwood." He turned back. "You have thought about that storm, have you not?" she said. "Otherwise you would not have come looking." It was not quite a question, but it required an answer. "I have thought about it every month of the past 2 years," he said, and he did not dress it up, because she was clearly the kind of woman who valued honesty over elegance. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they receive information that confirms something they already suspected. 6 o'clock, she said, and went back to her work. Joel walked back out into the Kansas afternoon and stood in the sunlight for a moment with something that felt enormously like happiness moving through him, warm and a little startling, like the first real heat of spring after a long winter. He spent the intervening hours at the livery stable tending his horse, and then walking the town in a way that was not quite aimless, stopping to look at the hardware that Pruitt had mentioned a man named Griffith had considered setting up, which had clearly never happened, and thinking about things he had not let himself think about directly in 2 years. He was a cowboy, which was to say he was a man with a good horse, a sound set of skills, and a life that was mostly conducted out of doors and across other people's land. He was not a man of property. He had some money saved, not a great deal but not nothing, accumulated across years of trail work and horse breaking, and the occasional contract job that paid better than average. He had no roots planted anywhere in particular, which had never troubled him before, but which he was now examining with fresh eyes. A woman like Louisa Sawyer had roots. She had built something, a business, even a modest one, even a hard one. She had stayed in a town and made herself part of it, had cared for her grandmother until the end and then kept going. She was not a woman who would want a man who was gone 6 months of every year pushing cattle up trails that led nowhere she could follow. He recognized this problem clearly. He recognized it, and then he set it aside for later consideration, because right now the thing he needed to do was have supper with her and discover whether what he had been carrying around for 2 years was the beginning of something real, or just the romantic invention of a solitary man who had spent too many nights under open skies with nothing but his own thoughts for company. The boarding house was kept by a woman named Mrs. Clara Dent, who was 60 if she was a day, and who ran her establishment with the kind of clean-handed firmness that would have done credit to a much larger operation. The dining room had 6 tables, and it was populated at 6 o'clock with a mixture of regulars and travelers, a surveyor's team and 2 men who looked like land speculators, and at a table near the window Louisa Sawyer, already seated, her hair neatly repinned, wearing a dress of dark blue that was clearly her good one. She had dressed up for this. That meant something. Joel had done what he could with what he had, which amounted to brushing his coat and hat clean and making sure his boots were presentable, which they were. He was not a man who owned many clothes, but what he had was kept in order. He crossed the room to her table and she looked up, and there was that smile again, the one that moved all the way to her eyes. "You found it without trouble," she said. "Small town," he said, and sat down across from her. "Everything is without trouble in a small town." "That is optimistic for someone who has not lived in one," she said, and there was a dry humor in it that delighted him. They ordered whatever Mrs. Dent was serving, which turned out to be beef stew and fresh bread, and they talked. Or rather, they began talking in the careful, exploratory way of 2 people who are honestly curious about each other, and have enough sense to proceed with that curiosity directly. She told him about her grandmother, Margaret Sawyer, who had come to Kansas from Ohio with Louis's grandfather in the 1860s, when this part of the territory was still a genuinely wild proposition, and who had outlasted her husband by 12 years and raised Louisa after Louis's own parents had both died of a fever when she was 9. She told it without self-pity as a simple accounting of what had happened, but her voice was warm when she talked about her grandmother, warmer than the rest. "She was a hard woman," Louisa said, "but not unkind. She taught me how to work, and she taught me that work is not a punishment but a practice, that you become something through it." "What did you become?" Joel asked, and it was a genuine question, not flattery. Louisa considered it seriously, which he liked. "Capable," she said finally. "I became capable. I'm not sure I became everything I might have wanted to be, but I am capable, and that covers a great deal of ground." He told her about himself with equal directness, which meant acknowledging the things that were honest and not dressing them up. He had grown up in Missouri, the third of 5 children in a farming family that had worked hard and stayed poor. Not desperately poor, but the kind of poor where everything required calculation. He had left at 18 to take work wherever it was available, and the work had gradually become cattle work because that was where the wages were in the 1870s, and he had become good at it, good enough to be valuable on the big drives, good enough to be trusted with responsibilities beyond simply riding drag and eating dust. "You like it," she said. It was an observation, not a question. "I do," he said. "I like the open country, and I like horses, and I like the work itself. What I do not like is that it takes me away from everything else for months at a time. Have you ever thought about doing something else?" He looked at her steadily. "I am thinking about it more than I used to," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at her bread, and there was a soft color in her face that might have been the warmth of the room and might have been something else. They talked through supper, and then through a second cup of coffee that Mrs. Dent brought without being asked, which suggested that Mrs. Dent had opinions about what was happening at that table and approved of it. They talked about the town and about Kansas and about the changes that were coming, the railroad moving ever closer, the fences going up on the open range that would eventually close off the great cattle trails and make men like Joel either adapt or disappear. "The world is changing fast," Louisa said, and she did not sound afraid of it, just thoughtful. "It always was," Joel said. "I think we just notice it more when we get older." She laughed at that, a real laugh, sudden and bright, and it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. He walked her back to the laundry afterward because she lived in the 2 rooms above it, and they stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk in the cool evening air with the stars coming out overhead in the vast Kansas sky. "I am here for 2 days," he said. "My outfit is camped 15 miles south. Would you be willing to spend some of that time with me, Miss Sawyer?" "I have a business to run," she said, "but I have Sunday afternoon free, as I always do. If you were to come by Sunday afternoon, I could show you the creek the town is named for, which most visitors never bother to find. It is genuinely worth seeing." "Then I will be here Sunday afternoon," he said. She looked up at him in the starlight, and he saw something in her face that was more than courtesy and more than simple friendliness, a kind of warmth that was personal and directed and real. "Good night, Mr. Underwood," she said. "Good night, Miss Sawyer," he said, and he walked back toward the livery stable where he had arranged a cot in the hayloft, and he was fairly certain his feet did not entirely connect with the ground the whole way there. Sunday came. He arrived at the laundry at noon, and she came out wearing a light shawl and carrying a small basket, and they walked east through the town, and then along a path that wound through a stand of cottonwoods, and arrived, after about 20 minutes, at a creek that was not large but was beautiful in the way that water in a flat country is always beautiful, the way it catches light and sound and makes everything around it feel alive. There was a grassy bank, and she spread an old blanket from the basket, and there were biscuits that she had made that morning, and dried apple slices, and a small jar of honey, and cold coffee in a tin flask. It was a picnic assembled from modest resources with a kind of care that was its own kind of eloquence. They sat in the dappled light under the cottonwoods and talked for 4 hours without once running out of things to say. He learned that she had wanted to teach school when she was young, before her grandmother needed more help than a part-time arrangement allowed. He learned that she read whatever she could get her hands on, which in Caldera Creek was not extensive, but she made the most of what there was. The storekeeper's wife had a collection of novels that she lent out informally. He learned that she had opinions about everything from the management of water rights to the novels of Charles Dickens, and that her opinions were thoughtful and specific, and did not shift simply because someone disagreed with them. She learned about him too. She asked questions that were intelligent and direct, the kind that got past the surface quickly, and he answered them honestly because there did not seem to be any other reasonable approach with her. She asked whether he was a religious man, and he said he believed in something larger than himself, but was uncertain about specifics, and she had nodded as though that was a reasonable answer. She asked whether he had ever been married or close to it, and he said no, and she had asked why, and he had said, "I have not met anyone who made me want to stay in one place until fairly recently," and the look she gave him after that was quiet and shining and stayed with him for a long time. As the afternoon light began to angle low and gold through the cottonwood leaves, she said, "When does your outfit move north?" "Tomorrow morning," he said. There was a silence that was not empty. "I do not know how to do this," she said finally, and it was so honest and undefended that it made something ache in him. "I have lived here all my life, and you are a man who goes wherever the cattle go, and I do not know how to begin something when I can already see the ending of it." "I do not know that it has an ending," he said carefully. "You are leaving tomorrow." "Yes," he said, "but I am coming back, Louisa, if you are willing to let me." She turned to look at the creek for a moment, the water catching the last good light of the afternoon. Then she turned back to him with that level gaze that he had come to understand was how she looked when she was deciding something important. "I am willing," she said, "but I need you to understand something. I am not a woman who holds on to things that are not real. If this is not real for you, then I would rather know it now." He reached across the blanket and took her hand, which was reddened and strong from work and warm in his, and he held it carefully, as though it were something worth being careful with. "It is the most real thing I have encountered in a very long time," he said. She looked at their hands, and she did not pull away. He rode out the next morning with his outfit, but something had fundamentally changed in the arithmetic of his life. He had something now that was not just a memory in a storm but an ongoing fact. A woman in Kansas who was expecting him to return, who had let him hold her hand in the afternoon light by a creek, and who had looked at him with an honesty that made every other consideration feel secondary. He wrote her a letter from Abilene, 3 weeks later, which was the first real letter he had written since he was a boy writing home to his mother. He wrote it carefully, crossing out and rewriting more than was dignified, and sent it with a man heading south who promised to post it. He told her about the drive and about the landscape and about the things he was thinking, and he told her directly that he intended to be back in Caldera Creek before winter. Her reply came 6 weeks later and found him at the end of the drive, camped outside a supply town in northern Kansas. The handwriting on the envelope was the same careful hand from the shopping list, and he sat with the letter for a moment before opening it, savoring the fact of it. She wrote as she spoke, directly and with precision, and with occasional flashes of dry humor that he was coming to recognize as one of his favorite things about her. She described the progress of the laundry business and a minor dispute with the town council over water access that she had resolved satisfactorily. She described the first frost and the way the cottonwoods by the creek had gone gold and then bare. She said she had been rereading a novel she had borrowed from the storekeeper's wife and found it more meaningful on second reading than on first, which she thought was probably true of most things worth having. And at the end she wrote, "I find myself looking forward to November with an interest I did not previously expect." He read that last line 3 times. He finished the drive contract in late October and declined 2 additional winter contracts that would have kept him in the north. His trail boss, a solid and practical man named Hector Osman, had given him a long look when he turned down the work. "A woman," Osman had said. "A woman," Joel had confirmed. "Good," Osman had said, and that was the end of that conversation. Joel rode south. He arrived in Caldera Creek on the 3rd of November, 1883, in the afternoon of a clear, cold day, and he went directly to the laundry on Birch Street. He could see the steam from the chimney before he even turned the corner. He walked in, and there she was, behind the counter this time, writing in a ledger book, and she looked up at the sound of the door, and there was a moment where neither of them moved, and then something broke open in both their faces at the same time, a recognition that was also a relief, the relief of a thing that was hoped for actually arriving. "November," he said. "You made it," she said. He came around the counter, and she stood up from her stool, and he took both her hands, and they stood like that for a long moment in the steam-warmed room, just holding on, as though this were something they had been doing forever and had only briefly interrupted. "I am thinking about staying," he said. "More permanently, if you would like that." "What would you do?" she asked, practical to the last. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "There is horse work to be had anywhere there are horses. I can break and train, and I can manage stock. A place like Caldera Creek with the ranches around it growing, there is real work in that. It is not the long trail, but I find I am done with the long trail." She was watching his face very carefully. "You would not regret it, staying." He looked at her. This woman who had borrowed his coat in a storm and given it back before he could even say goodbye, and then lived in his thoughts for 2 years like something permanent. "The only thing I have regretted in 2 years is not coming back sooner," he said. She leaned forward then, quite deliberately, and kissed him on the cheek, which in 1883 in a small Kansas town was a statement of intention that was perfectly clear to both parties. Her lips were warm against his skin, and her hands tightened briefly in his. "Then I would like that very much," she said. He stayed. He found a room at the boarding house and spent the first weeks re-establishing himself in the town, finding what work was available, talking to the ranch owners in the surrounding county about horse work. There was more than he had expected. The ranches were expanding, new stock was coming in, and a man with a genuine eye for horses and the practical skill to match was not unwelcome. He and Louisa spent their time carefully, as was proper, but with a steady and growing ease. He came to supper at the boarding house 2 evenings a week when she was not occupied. On Sunday afternoons they walked, sometimes to the creek, sometimes along the roads that led out of town into the flat expanse of prairie that Joel found beautiful even now, or perhaps especially now, because he was seeing it with the intention of belonging to it rather than just passing through. He got to know her in the small ways that reveal a person more honestly than grand gestures do. He learned that she was deeply organized and slightly impatient with people who were not, that she kept her accounts in a handwriting so precise it looked typeset, that she was generous with money when she had it to spare and completely unsentimental about going without when she did not. He learned that she laughed most freely when she was a little tired, and that she had a habit of solving problems out loud by talking through them in a quiet voice while she worked, not quite talking to herself, but not quite needing an audience either. He learned that she was lonely in the way that self-sufficient people are lonely, that she had managed entirely on her own for so long that she had learned to need no one, which is different from wanting no one, and that the distinction cost her something. He told her so one Sunday afternoon by the creek directly, because indirection seemed wrong with her. "You are capable of needing someone," he said. "You know that." She was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "I am aware of it as a theoretical matter," she said finally. "It is not a weakness." "I know it is not," she said. "I also know that needing someone requires believing they will stay, and I have not had a great deal of evidence that things stay." He reached over and put his hand over hers on the blanket. "I am working on providing that evidence," he said. She turned her hand under his so that their fingers interlaced, and she held on, and that was enough of an answer. December came, and with it the winter, which in Kansas was not to be taken lightly. Joel was busy with stable work throughout the cold months, which suited him, and the income was steady if modest. He had already arranged with a rancher named Callahan, whose spread was 8 miles east of town, to take on a contract in the spring for breaking a new string of horses, which would keep him local and earning. He had Christmas dinner at the boarding house along with a dozen other regulars, and Louisa was there, and Mrs. Dent had put them beside each other at the table with the same no-nonsense approval she seemed to have for everything she decided was correct. And he had given Louisa a small gift he had spent some time considering, a book from a catalog that he had special ordered through Prout's store, a collected volume of natural history that he had heard her mention wanting. She had opened it and run her fingers over the cover with something in her face that was private and moved, and she had said, "Thank you," in a voice that was quieter than usual, which told him he had gotten it right. She had given him a pair of riding gloves that she had made herself, lined with rabbit fur, cut and stitched with the same precise care she brought to everything. They fit perfectly, which meant she had paid attention to his hands without appearing to, and he had put them on and said, "These are the finest gloves I have owned," which was true. January and February were cold and slow and good. He saw her less in those months, because the town contracted into itself in the deepest winter, but they kept up their letters, passing them back and forth by the simple method of leaving them with Harlan Prout, which the old man clearly found either tremendously romantic or terribly inconvenient, and since he kept doing it, presumably it was the former. In March, when the first real warmth began to come back into the Kansas air, Joel went to Caldera Creek's one lawyer, a man named Aldous Hewitt who handled the legal business of half the county from an office above Prout's store, and had a conversation about what licenses and permissions and processes might be involved in setting up a legitimate horse-training operation on a small parcel of land. He had been saving. He had been saving since he was 18 and had always saved more than he spent, because there was nothing to spend it on when you lived on the trail, and over 15 years of work it had accumulated into something modest but real. He told no one what he was doing except Hector Osman, his old trail boss, who happened to come through Caldera Creek in March with a small remuda he was delivering east and stopped for a night. They sat together at the boarding house over supper, and Joel laid out the plan in plain terms, because Osman was a man who understood practical plans, and Joel wanted to hear it back from someone who would tell him honestly if he was being a fool. Osman had listened without interruption, which was his way, and then said, "You are not being a fool. The horse work is real, the market is real, and the woman sounds like someone worth building something for. The question is whether you can make the land work financially in the first 2 years before it pays properly, and based on what you have saved, I think you can manage it." "I think so too," Joel said. "Then stop asking people and do it," Osman said, and finished his stew. Joel bought the land in April. It was 7 acres east of town, between the main road and Callahan's western fence line, with a small creek that ran through the back third of it and a stand of trees that would provide windbreak. There was no house on it, just an old lean-to shed that would serve as a temporary stable while he built something better. The price was within his means and the deed was in his name, and he walked the 7 acres the afternoon he got the deed back from Hewitt, standing in the April mud with the spring wind moving through the new grass, and he felt something settle into place inside him that had been loose his entire life. He had land now. He had a place. He went directly from Hewitt's office to the laundry on Birch Street. Louisa was at the counter, going through her accounts, and she looked up when he came in and saw something in his face that made her put down her pen. "What has happened?" she said. He put the deed on the counter and slid it across to her. She picked it up and read it, and then she read it again, and then she looked up at him with an expression that was complicated and searching and full of something he wanted very much to understand. "You bought land," she said. "I bought land," he said. 7 acres east of town. 7 acres east of town, for your horse work. For my horse work," he said, "and for whatever else might come after, if you are willing." She set the deed down very carefully on the counter. She was looking at him with the fullest version of that look he had come to know, the one that weighed and measured, and then arrived at conclusions with absolute clarity. "Joel Underwood," she said, and it was the first time she had used his full name and his given name in the same breath, and it meant something. "Are you asking me something?" "I am getting to it," he said, and he was. He came around the counter, which he had done before, and he took her hands, which he had done before, but this time he said what he had been working toward for months. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build a house on that land, and I want to run a proper horse operation, and I want you beside me for all of it, every day of it, for the rest of my life. I'm not a man with grand things to offer, but I am honest and I work hard, and I am never going anywhere again, not for long. I love you, Louisa. I have loved you since a storm in October of 1881 when you walked out into the rain in my coat and did not look back." She stood very still for a moment, and he could see that she was keeping her face composed with some effort. "You have loved me since then," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Since exactly then," he said. She took a breath that was long and slow, and then she stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, and she was quiet for a moment in that way of someone who is feeling something too large for immediate speech. Then she said into his shoulder, "I have loved you since you handed me your coat without asking anything in return. I did not know what to do with that. You could have stayed and told me your name properly," he said. She laughed, muffled against his coat. "I was frightened. Of me. Of what I wanted," she said, and pulled back to look at him with honest eyes. "Yes, I will marry you. I would very much like to marry you." He kissed her then, the first time, a proper kiss, and the afternoon light came through the laundry windows and the steam rose from the back rooms, and it was, by any reasonable measure, the best moment of his life so far. They were married in June of 1884 at the small white church on the edge of Caldera Creek, which was the only church in town and served all denominations with ecumenical practicality. It was a Wednesday, because that was the day Louisa could most conveniently close the laundry, and the wedding was attended by Mrs. Dent, Harlan Prout, and his wife, a selection of townspeople who had watched this development with interest over the winter, Hector Osmond, who had ridden 2 days to be there, and a handful of ranch hands from Callahan's spread who came cleaned up and respectful. Louisa wore a dress of ivory cotton that she had made herself, trimmed with a small amount of lace that was the one extravagance of the whole affair, and she had flowers in her hair that Mrs. Dent had gathered that morning from her garden, and she was the most beautiful thing Joel had ever seen standing at the altar of that plain white church in the Kansas summer. He said his vows in a clear voice with no hesitation, because there was no hesitation in him. She said hers looking directly at him with those warm brown eyes, and her voice was steady except for the smallest catch on the word always, which told him everything he needed to know about how completely she meant it. Afterward there was a modest celebration at the boarding house, food and music from a fiddle player Osmond had discovered somewhere along his 2-day ride, and Joel danced with his wife on the boarding house porch in the long summer evening, and she was laughing, genuinely and freely, the tired laugh that was her best laugh, and he thought that this was what people meant when they talked about a life being good. They moved into the small house he had been building on the 7-acre parcel for the past 2 months, with help from several men in town who understood that this kind of community labor was both practical and a proper expression of welcome. The house was not large, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it was solid and tight and faced east so the morning light came in good through the main window, which Louisa had said when she saw the framing was the thing she cared most about, good morning light. She kept the laundry on Birch Street. It was her business and she had built it, and she ran it with the same efficient purpose she had always brought to it, making the short walk into town 3 mornings a week and sometimes more during busy periods. Joel had not suggested she give it up, and it would not have occurred to him to do so, because it was hers and she was good at it, and it contributed to their household in a real way, and beyond all that, it was a piece of her independence that she had earned at cost, and he respected it absolutely. He ran the horse operation from the property, building a proper stable over the summer with lumber hauled from the nearest mill, adding a round pen and a training area, taking on horses from Callahan and two other ranchers, and building a reputation in the county for honest work and genuine results. He had a talent for reading horses that he had developed over 15 years on the trail, an ability to understand what a particular animal needed in order to trust and cooperate, and it translated directly into a training practice that was more effective than the methods many men used, which relied on domination rather than understanding. Word spread, as word does in ranching country, and by the autumn of 1884 he had more work than he could comfortably manage alone, which was a good problem. He hired a boy named Ruben Cortez, 16 years old, the son of a Mexican ranch worker who had come up from Texas with a Callahan cattle drive and stayed. Ruben was quick and observant, and had the natural patience with animals that could not be taught but could be developed, and Joel taught him everything he knew with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who understood that the best investment you could make in a business was the person working beside you. Ruben's family had faced the particular injustice that Mexican workers in Kansas faced in that period, the wage differences and the social dismissal, and the assumption of lesser worth that had no basis in reality and every basis in prejudice. Joel paid Ruben the same wage he would have paid any young man of his competence, which was more than most in the county would have offered, and he said directly to the boy on the first day of work, "You do the job right and I will treat you right. That is the whole of it." Ruben had given him a look that was a mixture of surprise and something older and more tired than surprise, and then had said, "Yes, sir," and gotten to work, and within a month was indispensable. The autumn was good and busy, and the winter that followed was easier than the previous one because they had more in the house now, physically, and in every other sense. They had their arguments, as married people do, because both of them had opinions and both of them were accustomed to managing things their own way. She found his tendency to underplan finances irritating. He found her reluctance to ask for help even when she genuinely needed it frustrating. They had a genuine disagreement in the fall about whether to expand the stable in the spring, Joel arguing for it, and Louisa arguing that the money was not quite secure enough yet to justify the debt. They had the argument fairly, with specifics, and Louisa's numbers were more careful than his, and they went with her plan, which turned out to be correct. He told her it had been correct. She did not say "I told you so," because that was not her way, but she did allow herself a small, self-satisfied look that he found completely endearing. In the winter of 1884 going into 1885, Louisa told him over breakfast one morning, with a composure that was characteristic but did not quite hide the trembling edge of something enormous in her voice, that she was expecting a child. He had put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and she had looked back at him with those steady brown eyes and the particular combination of joy and apprehension that the reality of a child brings, and he had stood up and come around the table and gathered her in and held her, and she had pressed her face against his neck, and they had stood like that in the kitchen in the early winter morning for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not say better. "Are you frightened?" he said eventually. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Enormously," he said honestly, which made her laugh, and the laugh dissolved the last of the trembling edge in her voice. Their son was born in July of 1885, a full-summer baby delivered by the town's doctor, a steady woman named Dr. Agnes Hill who had come to Caldera Creek 2 years earlier and whose presence in the town Joel had come to regard as one of its greater assets. He had waited outside the bedroom door for 4 hours that were the longest of his life, listening to sounds that alternately frightened him and told him nothing, until Dr. Hill opened the door and said with professional calm, "You have a son, Mr. Underwood, and your wife is doing well." He had gone in and Louisa was pale and exhausted and radiant with it, the way women sometimes are after enormous effort, and she had the child in her arms already, wrapped in the white blanket she had spent the previous 3 months making, and she had looked up at him with a smile that was different from any other smile she had ever given him, deeper and more complete. The child was red and small and very much present in the world, his eyes scrunched shut, his hands curled into tiny fists. "He needs a name," Louisa said. "I was thinking Thomas," Joel said. He had been thinking it for months after his grandfather, a man who had been good to him when he was young. Louisa looked down at the baby, considering. "Thomas Underwood," she said. "Yes, that fits him." Thomas was, from his first weeks, a person of decided opinions expressed at considerable volume. He was healthy and demanding and fascinated by everything, which Joel took as evidence of a good nature, and Louisa took as a warning about the years ahead. She was right about the warning, and he was right about the nature. Thomas was difficult and delightful in equal measure from infancy onward. The laundry business continued, and the horse operation grew. By 1886, Joel had 2 additional horses in training at a time, and was beginning to develop a specific reputation for working with difficult animals, horses that other men had given up on or were considering putting down. He had a particular patience for it, the ability to stay quiet and present with an animal that was frightened or poorly handled without demanding immediate results, and it worked in ways that impressed even the skeptical ranchers who brought him their problem horses expecting to be told nothing could be done. Ruben Cortez had become, by this point, genuinely skilled. He was 18 now and working with a confidence and competence that Joel was genuinely proud of. Not possessively proud, but the way you are proud of a person you watched learn something real. Joel had pushed for Ruben to handle a full training contract on his own for the first time in the spring of 1886, with a Callahan mare that had a bad history with men but not, Joel suspected, with patient handling, and Ruben had brought the mare around beautifully in 6 weeks. "That is your work," Joel had told him afterward, "and your name belongs on it." Ruben had accepted this with a quiet dignity that said more than speech would have. Life in Caldera Creek continued its particular pace, which was faster than outside eyes might have credited because small towns are never as simple or slow as they appear. There were politics of water rights among the ranchers that occasionally threatened to turn serious. A dispute in 1886 between 2 neighboring spreads over a diverted creek that Joel got pulled into as a neutral party because both men trusted him. A negotiation he handled with the same steady patience he brought to horses. There was the coming of the railroad spur in 1887, which changed the economics of the county significantly, making it possible to ship cattle east without the long trail drive, and doing what everyone had known was coming for years, ending the era of the great cattle drives as a dominant feature of life in this part of Kansas. Joel thought about that. In the spring of 1887, when the railroad work crews came through, and the sound of hammering and the smell of new-laid track became part of the air for several months. He thought about the life he had lived before, the long trails and the open country and the freedom that was not really freedom but a kind of magnificent homelessness, and he weighed it against what he had now, the land under his feet that was his, the house with the good morning light, Thomas running between the fence posts of the paddock with the determined energy of a 2-year-old who has recently discovered he is capable of movement and intends to use it extensively. And Louisa coming out through the kitchen door in the morning with her hair not yet fully pinned, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He chose every morning without difficulty. In the summer of 1887, Louisa told him over breakfast again, with the same composure that was not quite hiding the edges of enormous feeling, that there would be another child. Thomas was 2 by then and into everything, and the house was already full of him, and they both laughed at the new information the way people laugh at something that is genuinely wonderful and also genuinely complicated. "Are you frightened again?" she said. "Less than the first time," he said, which was true. "Good," she said, "because I need you to be the calm one. I believe I used up my calmness on Thomas's arrival." The second child was a girl, born in February of 1888, in the cold heart of a Kansas winter that reminded Joel of that first storm in Caldera Creek, the one that had started all of this. She was born at dawn, and Dr. Hill brought her out to the world with the same professional composure she brought to everything. And when Joel went in and saw Louisa holding their daughter, the light coming pale and cold through the winter window behind them, he had to lean against the doorframe for a moment because the beauty of it was simply too much to receive standing upright. "Clara," Louisa said, when he came close. "I would like to name her Clara after Mrs. Dent. She has been kinder to us than she had any obligation to be." Joel looked at his daughter, at the small, perfect face still new to the air, and then at his wife and said, "Clara is exactly right." He went to the boarding house the next day and told Mrs. Dent. The old woman sat down in a chair and pressed her hands together and did not speak for a moment, and then said, "That is the finest thing anyone has done for me in 30 years." And she was not a woman who said things she did not mean. Thomas, when introduced to his sister, approached her with the serious investigative energy he brought to all new things, examined her carefully, announced "small," which was accurate, and then went back to his horses, which were wooden and which Joel had made for him during the winter evenings. The household arranged itself around Clara's arrival with the adaptive efficiency of a family that had already learned how to do more than it thought it could. Louisa reorganized the laundry schedule to take on a part-time assistant, a girl of 16 named Nettie who was quick and trustworthy, which gave Louisa more manageable hours while Clara was small. Joel took on more of the early mornings with Thomas so Louisa could rest when the baby allowed it, which was less often than either of them hoped. They were tired in a way that was productive tiredness, the kind that comes from building something real. And in the evenings when both children were finally sleeping, they sat together on the porch in the long summer evenings or by the stove in the winter, and talked in the quiet way of people who have said enough significant things that the ordinary things between them carry their own weight. He still had the old oilskin coat. It hung on a peg by the door where it had hung since they moved into the house, and it was battered and worn but serviceable, and he wore it in hard weather the way he always had. Louisa occasionally passed it on her way out in the morning and ran her hand along the sleeve without comment, and he saw her do it and understood it as a kind of acknowledgement of everything that coat represented, the whole long chain of events that had begun with a storm and a stranger's generosity, and had led, through an improbable series of choices and distances and letters and a creak in the afternoon, and a deed on a counter, to this house and this life and these children. One evening in the fall of 1888, with Thomas 3 years old and sleeping in his bed and Clara 7 months old and settled in her cradle and the house quiet around them, Louisa said, out of the relative silence, "Do you remember what it felt like before all this?" He thought about it honestly. "I remember the country," he said, "and I remember that it was beautiful in a way that was also lonely." "Were you lonely?" "I did not know I was until I stopped being," he said. She was sitting across from him with a piece of mending in her lap, and she looked up at him with those brown eyes that he had spent 2 years trying to remember precisely and would now, he thought, never forget. "I was lonely for a very long time," she said. "I was quite good at it." "You were," he agreed. "I am not any more," she said. "No," he said. "Neither am I." She set down the mending and crossed the room and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side and they sat by the stove with the autumn wind moving against the windows and the children sleeping in the next room, and it was the simplest and most complete thing he had ever experienced. The years moved on in the way that good years do, not slowly and not fast, but with a sense of appropriate weight, each season adding something to the structure of the life they had built. The horse operation expanded again in 1889, when Joel was able to add a second proper stable and take on 3 horses at a time in training, and Reuben, now 21, had taken on a full partner's role in everything but the legal paperwork, which Joel intended to address properly. He did address it in 1890, drawing up an agreement with Aldous Hewitt's help that gave Reuben Cortez a genuine stake in the operation, a share of the profits, and a path toward partnership in the business that reflected honestly what Reuben contributed to it. Reuben had read the document with care and then looked up at Joel with an expression that was carefully composed in the way of a man who is determined not to show that he is moved. "You did not have to do this," Reuben said. "You earned it," Joel said, "and I want the business to last past me. It will last better if it has you in it properly." Reuben shook his hand with a grip that was firm and held for a moment longer than the formal transaction required, and that was enough. Thomas, who was 5 years old by 1890, had discovered horses in the way that some children discover things that will define them, with a wholeness of attention that left no room for doubt about direction. He was at the stable at every opportunity, following Reuben around with a seriousness that made the young man grin, and following his father with an attentiveness that Joel found occasionally humbling, because the boy was watching everything he did and recording it, and that made you aware of what you were doing in new ways. He started teaching Thomas properly at 5, not the pretend teaching of putting a child on a horse and leading it in circles, but actual instruction in how to approach a horse, how to read its attention, how to make yourself understood to an animal that did not share your language. Thomas absorbed it with the same focused patience that Joel had thought was a natural disposition in him alone, and to see it reproduced in his son with such clarity was something that exceeded what he had words for. Louisa watched her son and her husband at the round pen one Saturday morning from the fence rail, Clara on her hip and the October light bright and clean around them, and she thought about the storm that had put this all in motion, the blue norther that had come screaming out of the north and driven a solitary cowboy into Harlan Pruitt's store on the same afternoon. She happened to need flour and salt and a small tin of molasses. She thought about the coat, heavy and oilskin smooth and smelling of horses and wood smoke, that she had pulled on over her dress and walked out into the rain in, and how she had thought about it the whole mile and a half home, not about the coat itself, but about the man who had given it without being asked, without asking for anything in return, with a matter-of-fact generosity that had felt, in that moment of a cold and windy afternoon, like something close to grace. She had thought about him for 2 years after that, which she had told very few people. She had told her grandmother because her grandmother had been impossible to deceive and had the further inconvenience of being genuinely wise. Margaret Sawyer had listened to the story of the coat and the cowboy with an expression that said she was reserving judgment, and then she had said, "Did you get his name?" "Joel Underwood," Louisa had said. "And do you know where he was going?" "No, he was a trail rider. He could have been anywhere." "Then you had better hope the trails bring him back through," her grandmother had said, with a practicality that was not without its romantic edge. The trails had brought him back. And here was what they had brought back to. The two of them at the fence rail watching Thomas and his father in the October light, Clara heavy and warm on her hip, the stable and the paddock, and the 7 acres stretching out eastward under a sky that was everything the Kansas sky was, enormous and indifferent and gorgeous. "Mama," Clara said, pointing at nothing in particular with the authority of a child who expects the world to be interested in whatever she finds interesting. "Yes," Louisa said, kissing her daughter's hair. "Yes, I see." That evening after supper, after the children were in bed, Joel came in from checking the stable and found Louisa standing by the peg near the door with his old oilskin coat in her hands. She was running her fingers along the worn fabric the way she sometimes did, that quiet acknowledgment he had noticed before. He came to stand beside her, looking at the coat. "2 years I carried that thing before I came back," he said. "I know," she said. "Harlan Pruitt told me you were asking after me the morning before you left. That first time 2 years before." He looked at her. "He told you that." "Eventually," she said. "When you had come back the second time and it was clear you were not leaving again. He said you had asked where I was and then walked out looking like a man who had just gotten news that was better than he expected." Joel thought about that. "He was not wrong," he said. Louisa hung the coat back on its peg with the same care she always used with it, straightening it so it hung just so. Then she turned to him and put her hand against his face, palm warm on his jaw, and looked at him with the fullness of everything she was, the practicality and the warmth and the humor and the love that she had arrived at through the long route of self-sufficiency and loneliness, and then the deliberate choice to let someone in. "I am glad you gave me the coat," she said. "So am I," he said, and covered her hand with his. He pulled her close in the lamplight of their kitchen in their house on their 7 acres east of Caldera Creek, Kansas, in the fall of 1890, and she rested against him with the complete ease of a person who has found the exact place they belong in the world, and they stood like that for a long time, listening to the wind move across the prairie outside and the quiet sounds of their children sleeping in the next room. Spring came again in 1891, and with it a letter from Joel's youngest sister in Missouri, who had written to say that their mother was aging and their father had passed the previous winter, which Joel had not known because the letter had been delayed by months, traveling through 2 postal offices before finding him. He held the news of his father's death with the complicated grief of a man who had had a difficult and loving relationship with a parent and who had not been present at the end, and Louisa sat with him that evening and let him talk through it without trying to resolve anything, because she understood that some grief needed air rather than answers. He wrote to his sister and his remaining brothers, and he put into those letters the return address of the Underwood horse operation on the main road east of Caldera Creek, Kansas, which was the permanent address of a man who had a permanent place, which his family had not had from him in 15 years of riding. His sister wrote back with a warmth that told him this had been noticed and was welcome. In the summer of 1891, when Clara was 3 and Thomas was 6, and the horse operation was running as smoothly as it ever had, Louisa closed the laundry on Birch Street. She had thought about it for a year, and made the decision with the same careful arithmetic she brought to all decisions. The business had served its purpose and served it well. It had kept her solvent through the years of her grandmother's illness and through her own independent years, and it had been her own in a way that had mattered enormously. But the work was hard on her hands and her back, and the household income from the horse operation was now sufficient that it was no longer necessary, and there were other things she wanted to do with those hours. She told Joel over breakfast, in the same way she told him most significant things, directly and after she had fully made up her mind. "I am going to close the laundry at the end of the month," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "I have been doing the numbers for 6 months. We do not need it and I am tired of it, and there are other things I would like to do." "What things?" he asked, genuinely curious. She had a list. She had wanted to help establish a lending library for the town, something she had been thinking about since she had first started borrowing novels from the storekeeper's wife. There were children in Caldera Creek who had limited access to books and to education, and while the town had a school, it had a school with limited resources, and she had thoughts about what an engaged volunteer effort might add to it. She wanted to spend more hours with Thomas and Clara during the years when they were still young enough to want her company unreservedly, and she wanted, she said, looking at him steadily across the breakfast table, a little more time that was simply hers and simply theirs. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers on the tablecloth. "All of that sounds right to me," he said. The laundry closed at the end of July 1891. Nettie, the assistant, found a position at a comparable laundry in the next town, which Louisa had arranged before the closing so the girl would not be left without work. The equipment was sold to a woman in Abilene who was starting a similar operation, and the building on Birch Street reverted to its owner, who had always been Harlan Prout, who made no complaint about the return of it and told Louisa that she had kept the place in better condition than he had given it to her in, which was the truest thing. What she built in the months after was the lending library, which began as 2 shelves of books in the back room of Pruett's store, organized with the same precise care she had brought to her laundry accounts, and which grew within a year into a proper small room in a building that the town council, which Louisa attended with the attending force of a woman who has decided something is necessary, agreed to provide. She collected books through a network of correspondence that spread steadily outward, contacting county newspapers and church organizations, and eventually writing directly to a publisher in St. Louis, who responded to her letter with a donation of 50 volumes, which arrived by rail in the spring of 1892 and which caused considerable excitement in Caldera Creek. Thomas Underwood was the first child to check out a book from the Caldera Creek lending library, because his mother ran it and he was 6 years old, and already reading well enough to devour simple adventure stories with the same dedicated energy he brought to horses. He took out a book about exploration, brought it home, read it in 2 days and came back for another. Clara would learn to read the following year, and would prove to have a somewhat different character from her brother, methodical where he was impetuous, interested in the how of things where he was interested in the doing of them. Already at 3 years old, the kind of child who approached problems by watching them carefully for a long time before acting. Joel watched his children grow with the particular attentiveness of a man who had come to fatherhood later than some, and understood it as a thing not to be taken in stride, but to be fully present for. He was not a demonstrative man by the standards of sentiment, not a man who made speeches about his feelings, but he was present in all the ways that mattered, at the supper table every night, and in the stable on Saturday mornings with Thomas, and on the walk to the library on Thursday afternoons when Louisa opened it, and sometimes brought Clara along, who would sit in the corner with a book she could not yet fully read and pretend, with enormous seriousness, that she could. Reuben Cortez married a woman named Esperanza in the fall of 1892, a woman he had known for 2 years, and who had the same quality of quiet competence that Joel had always thought was the most attractive thing in a person. The wedding was a celebration held on the Cortez family property, which was modest but warmly kept, and the Underwoods attended as family, which was what they were by this point. Louisa brought a wedding gift of practical household items assembled with care, and Joel brought his genuine gladness for his partner's happiness, and they danced together at the celebration, while Thomas chased other children around the yard and Clara sat on a blanket and watched everything with her characteristic careful attention. In 1893, the country hit what would come to be called the panic, the economic contraction that hurt businesses and farms and banks across the nation, including in Kansas. It was a hard year. Several ranches in the county cut their horse budgets significantly, and 2 of Joel's regular clients suspended their arrangements for the season. The horse operation ran thin for the better part of 8 months, and the savings they had accumulated were what kept them from real difficulty, along with the vegetable garden that Louisa had established behind the house, and which proved its value most emphatically in 1893 by providing a substantial portion of what they ate through the summer and autumn. They managed. They were not comfortable through those months, but they were not desperate, and the deliberate frugality that both of them had practiced for most of their lives served them now as practical wisdom rather than mere habit. They ate what the garden gave them, and they did not spend what they did not have, and they talked plainly with each other about where they stood and what the options were, because that was how they had always managed things, together, and with full information. By the spring of 1894, the worst of the contraction had passed for them. The ranch operations in the county had stabilized, and the horse contracts resumed, and the lending library, which had cost very little to run even in the difficult year because Louisa had kept its finances as careful as everything else she touched, continued, and even added new volumes through the contacts she had developed. Thomas was 9 in 1894, and in school with a dedication that came entirely from within, because the school in Caldera Creek was adequate but not exceptional, and what drove Thomas was the horsework, which was not offered at school. He did his academic work with sufficient conscientiousness to pass his examinations, and then gave the remainder of his considerable energy to the stable, where Reuben was now his primary instructor in the mornings, because Joel had enough to manage with the training contracts to keep him occupied most of the day. Clara was 6, reading properly now, and had recently announced that she intended to be a teacher. Louisa had received this announcement with composed pleasure. Joel had said that sounded like exactly the right ambition for a person of her particular disposition, and Clara had nodded with the satisfaction of a child whose assessment of themselves has been confirmed by competent adults. The fall of 1894 brought a moment that surprised Joel in a way that very little surprised him anymore. He was working a young gelding in the round pen late one September afternoon, the light going amber and long across the pen, and he was aware of Louisa coming to lean on the rail the way she sometimes did at the end of her day, watching him work without comment, which was one of the things he loved about her, the willingness to simply watch something without needing to fill it with words. He brought the gelding to a gentle stop and came to the rail, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not immediately read. "What is it?" he said. "There will be another child," she said. He stood very still for a moment. She was 38 years old. He was 43. They had not expected this. He looked at her face and found in it all the complexity of the news, the surprise and the apprehension, and underneath it, careful and real, the same moving thing that had been there when she told him about Thomas and then Clara. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was the most important question. "I am well," she said. "Dr. Hill says so." "Good," he said, and he came through the gate into her, and he put both hands on her face and looked at her. "And how do you feel about it?" "Old," she said, which made them both laugh, sudden and real. "Not too old," he said. "No," she admitted. "Not too old, Doctor." Agnes Hill, who was now a permanent and beloved fixture of Caldera Creek, and who had delivered both Thomas and Clara, attended Louisa through the pregnancy with the professional thoroughness she brought to everything, and with a personal warmth that went beyond the professional, because she had known this family for 10 years and regarded them with genuine affection. The baby was born in the late spring of 1895, a boy, healthy and considerable in his own right from the first hour of his life, and they named him William after Joel's father, which felt like a debt properly paid. Thomas, who was 10, took a brotherly interest that was both protective and instructional from the beginning. Clara, who was 7, approached her new brother with the careful observational patience that defined her, and after 2 weeks of watching declared him interesting, which from Clara was high praise. The family settled into its new configuration with the adaptive ease of people who have learned that a house expands to hold what it needs to hold, if you have built it with enough love in the foundation. Years moved through their seasons with the particular richness of a life that is full without being easy. Thomas grew into a young man who was remarkable with horses, good in school when he applied himself, and perpetually impatient with subjects that seemed to him to have no connection to the actual world, which Joel understood from his own experience. By 16, he was doing training work beside Reuben that was genuinely his own, not assistance but real skill, and Reuben said to Joel privately that the boy had the best natural eye for a horse of anyone he had worked with, which was a significant statement from a man who had spent 20 years in the business. Clara grew into a reader of voracious appetite and a student of exceptional capability, and at 14 was helping her mother with the lending library and teaching younger children their letters on Sunday afternoons, in what had become an informal school supplement that the community had come to depend on without entirely acknowledging they were depending on it. She was, as she had predicted at 6, going to be a teacher, a fact that was no longer a prediction but simply a description of what she was already doing. William grew up knowing horses before he knew much else, because it was what the farm was, and knowing books because his mother made them available the way some families made tools available, as simply the basic equipment of a thinking life. He was a middle child by temperament as well as position, adaptable and inventive, and full of a particular playful quality that the older two, both of whom tended toward seriousness, did not have and found both charming and occasionally exhausting. In the spring of 1901, Thomas was 16 and Reuben Cortez and Joel called him into a formal conversation in the office of the horse operation, which was by now a real office with a real desk and a filing system that Louisa had established, and which neither Joel nor Reuben would have maintained without her, and told him that they were bringing him into the operation formally, and that what they were building was intended to last past all of them. Thomas sat in the chair across from his father and his mentor, and listened with the particular attentiveness of a young man who understands that something significant is happening and does not want to miss any of it. "What you have here," Joel said, "is something I started with 7 acres and some savings and the conviction that it was worth doing. Reuben has been part of it since almost the beginning, and he has made it more than it would have been without him. What I want is for you to be part of it in the same way, properly, as a person with a stake in it, not just as a son who works here." Thomas looked at his father and at Reuben, and Joel could see in his face the young man processing the weight of what was being offered, the responsibility of it as much as the opportunity. "I want that," Thomas said. "I want to build it further. There are things we could do with training that we have not tried yet. I have been reading about what they are doing with horse breeding in Kentucky, and I think there are methods that could improve what we do here." Joel looked at Reuben, and Reuben looked at Joel, and they both smiled. "Tell us about it," Joel said. That evening he told Louisa about the conversation. They were on the porch in the late spring dusk, which was a place they had spent countless evenings over the years, watching the last light go out across the prairie that had been the context of their entire life together, the enormous sky and the flat land and the wind that moved through the grass in patterns that changed every moment. "He is ready," Louisa said. "He is more than ready," Joel said. "He knows things about the work that I never knew." She leaned against him on the porch bench, her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable silence that was their particular specialty, the silence of two people who have said enough significant things over enough years that the quiet between them is full rather than empty. "We did something right," she said quietly. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "We did," he said. "Several things." Clara went to the Teachers' College in Abilene in the fall of 1901, the first member of either of their families to receive formal higher education beyond the basic level, a fact that Louisa noted without making a production of it, because Louisa had never been a woman who made productions of significant things, but simply acknowledged them and moved forward. She saw Clara onto the stage that would take her north and hugged her daughter hard, and then stood straight and watched her go. And Joel put his arm around her on the station platform and felt her breathe out slowly, the way you breathe out when something you hoped for has actually come true. William was 6 and still at home, and still deeply entertaining in the way that 6-year-old boys are entertaining, which is to say fully, exhaustingly, and with complete commitment to whatever he had decided was interesting that particular hour. The Caldera Creek Lending Library, by 1901, had grown from 2 shelves in the back of Pruitt's store to a proper small building, the first building in the town dedicated solely to books and reading, built partly through town council funding, and partly through a fundraising effort that Louisa had organized with her characteristic efficient persistence, and which had collected more money than anyone, including Louisa, had initially expected. Because when people understood what they were being asked to support, they proved more generous than the cautious estimate had accounted for. Harlan Pruitt had donated the first significant sum, which he had made without announcement, which was typical of him. Louisa had found out about it secondhand and gone to thank him personally, and the old man had said, "You are welcome. now stopped making a fuss about it, and gone back to his tobacco tins. He was 81 years old and still behind his counter. He would outlive his own best predictions by several years yet. Joel turned 50 in the fall of 1901. He was grayer at the temples, and there were lines in his face that had not been there when he rode into Caldera Creek in the spring of 1883, looking for a woman he had lent his coat to in a storm. But he was still straight and still strong and still fundamentally the same person, which was the test that mattered. Louisa marked the occasion by inviting the people who formed the real circle of their lives to supper at the house. Reuben and Esperanza Cortez and their 3 children, Mrs. Clara Dent, who was now in her 80s, and who had given her name to their daughter, and who still presided over the boarding house with undiminished authority, Dr. Agnes Hill, and several friends from the ranching community who had become genuine friends over 20 years of shared work and shared country. It was an evening of good food and good noise and the particular warmth of a gathering of people who like each other honestly. And afterward, when the house had cleared and the children were in bed and the last lamp was turned low, Joel and Louisa sat together in the kitchen in the comfortable quiet that was their oldest and best language. 50 years, she said. It sounds like a great deal when you say it like that, he said. It is a great deal, she said, and I am not sorry for any of it. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had taken it the first time on the blanket by the creek in the spring of 1883, when the afternoon light was long and golden and they were still learning each other, and held it with the same careful attentiveness he had brought to it then. "Neither am I," he said. "Not a day of it." She turned her hand in his and held back with the strength of a woman who had built her life with her hands, and who had chosen, deliberately and with full information, to build the best part of it with him. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, the same sky that had looked down on that October storm 20 years ago, the same sky that had witnessed the beginning of all of this. The coat and the rain and the woman walking away through the storm, and the cowboy standing in the doorway of Pruett's General Store watching her go and understanding, in some way he could not have articulated at the time, that something had just begun. The spring of 1902 brought Thomas his first full training season as a named partner in the operation. He brought the Kentucky breeding methods he had been reading about for 2 years to a practical application that produced results measurable enough that 2 new clients came to the operation based on word of what was being done there. Reuben oversaw the traditional work with his usual excellence, and Thomas's new approaches complemented rather than competed with it, which was a tribute to both of them and to the groundwork that Joel had laid in making the operation a place where people worked together rather than alongside. Joel was 51 and still working, though his role had shifted naturally toward the management and relationship side of things, the negotiation with ranchers and the financial oversight and the longer-term thinking, which suited a man of his experience and which left the physical work of the horses to the younger and stronger hands. He did not stop working with horses entirely, because he could not and would not, but he was selective about which animals he took on personally, and the ones he chose were invariably the most difficult cases, the ones that other approaches had not resolved, because that was where his particular patience was most valuable. Louisa ran the library and managed the household with the same even efficiency she had always brought to everything, and she had added, in the past year, a correspondence with the State Teachers Association about the establishment of rural school libraries across Kansas, writing letters that were models of persuasive clarity, and which were beginning to produce responses that suggested real progress might be achievable. Clara came home from her second year at the Teachers' College for the summer and was obviously transformed, not in her essential character, which was the same careful and precise person she had always been, but in the scope of what she was thinking about, the range of questions she was turning over. She had been exposed to ideas and to people from across the state and region, and the combination had done what good education does, not filled her with answers but sharpened her questions. She sat on the porch with her father one summer evening while Louisa was at the library and William was at the stable and talked about what she was learning and what she was planning. And Joel listened with the full attention he had always brought to his children and felt a pride that was also a recognition. This was who she had always been, and education had simply given her more room to be it. "I want to come back here eventually," Clara said, "after I have the certificate. They need a proper teacher here, someone with full training, and I know this county." "The town would be glad of it," Joel said. "I would be glad of it," Clara said simply, and Joel understood that she meant the coming home as much as the teaching. William, who was 7 in 1902 and would turn 8 in the late spring, was currently the primary concern of the household in the daily domestic sense, because he was at the age where everything was a potential experiment, and some of the experiments were more concerning than others. He had recently introduced a stray dog to the property without prior discussion, presenting both the dog and his reasoning for its presence simultaneously in a way that left very little room for objection. The dog, a rough-coated brown animal of uncertain parentage and excellent temperament, was named General by William, and had been accepted into the household after a period of negotiation that Joel privately thought showed early evidence of William's gift for finding his way to yes through apparent reasonableness. General the dog took to living on the property with an enthusiasm that suggested he had always known this was where he was supposed to be, and Thomas, who had initially been skeptical, had come around after the dog proved himself useful in the stable by being calm around the horses in a way that not all dogs managed. Life on the Underwood property in Caldera Creek in 1902 was, by the measure that mattered, a good life. It was not a life without difficulty or without the ordinary sorrows that came with time and loss and the hard nature of the country. It was not a life that had been given to them, but one that had been built, deliberately and with the investment of everything they had, their labor and their honesty and their love for each other, and for what they were making together. Joel looked at it sometimes from the outside, the way you can occasionally step outside your own life and see it clearly, and what he saw was a man who had come to a storm in a store in 1881 with nothing but his horse and his coat and his own 2 hands, and who had found, by giving one of those things to a woman who needed it, the thread that led to everything. He had never stopped thinking about her after that storm, not one day. That had been the truth when he said it to her in the laundry on Birch Street, and it was the truth still, not in the way of longing that has no object but in the way of a person who is the center of your world, whose presence shapes the quality of every day you live. He found her one afternoon in the late summer of 1902, sitting at the kitchen table with her correspondence spread before her, writing one of the letters to the State Teachers Association in the careful hand that had not changed in 20 years, still precise and clear, still the same hand that had written the shopping list that he had noticed in Prout's store all those years ago. She looked up when he came in. "There is coffee," she said. "I know," he said, and poured a cup and came to sit across from her at the table, and she went back to her letter, and he sat with his coffee and watched the afternoon light move across the kitchen, and listened to the sound of Thomas in the stable and William somewhere outside with the dog, and he thought that this was exactly what he would choose if someone gave him the choice again from the beginning, every day of it. Every hard winter, and every good summer, and every conversation at every table in every year of the life they had built together. She finished her paragraph and looked up and found him watching her with that look she had come to know over 19 years of marriage, the one that was not desire alone or affection alone but some combination of both and something larger than both, the look of a man who is exactly where he wants to be and knows it. "What?" she said, and there was a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Nothing," he said. "Everything is good." She held his gaze for a moment, and the smile moved all the way to her eyes, those warm brown eyes he had spent 2 years trying to remember and would never stop seeing for the rest of his life. "Yes," she said, "it is." She went back to her letter and he finished his coffee, and the afternoon light was long and golden through the kitchen window, and outside the Kansas sky was enormous and blue and going on forever. The same sky that had sent the storm that had sent him into that store that had sent him to this table in this kitchen with this woman. And the whole long chain of it was something he would not have traded for anything the world had ever offered or could offer. Not the open trail or the wide country or anything else that had ever called to him, because none of it compared to this, to her, to the life they had made in the space between a borrowed coat and forever.